Hello, and welcome to Treasury Talks, where we talk with lots of different people across the nation, specifically talking about some of the things that are most pertinent to our financial world. And with me today, I'm so honored to have Delaware's 74th Governor, Governor John Carney. He's been focused on making Delaware's economy more competitive, preparing Delaware's children to succeed, and building a long-term sustainable financial plan for the state of Delaware. From 2011 to 2017, he served as Delaware's lone member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And prior to his time in Congress, he served 2 terms as Delaware's lieutenant governor between 2001 and 2009. Under then Governor John Carper, he served as Delaware's Secretary of Finance and Deputy Chief of Staff. Before that, he was Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Newcastle County and on the staff of then Senator Joe Biden. In these roles, he helped Delaware earn its very first ever AAA bond rating, played a key role in the state's purchase of the Port of Wilmington, and worked to cut taxes 9 times. Governor, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Colleen. Thanks for having me.
I want to start just by giving the viewers a sense of your time as Secretary of Finance, how that experience prepared you for future roles like governor, and what skills you learned there that you might still be using today.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting place to start, really, with respect to my public service career, because I didn't, people ask me all the time, did you always want to be a member of Congress or lieutenant governor or governor? And not really. I grew up in a large Irish Catholic family, went to Catholic schools all the way through, and we were taught, that the most important thing that you could do in life every day in school from the nuns and from my parents was to serve and to help other folks. My parents were both school teachers, and so they did that. My mother ran an illegal daycare in our neighborhood with 9 kids until she went back and taught for 25 years at Ursuline Academy. And so it was really that sense of service to others that motivated me to follow a career in public service. And I never really thought I would run for office. I enjoyed being on the staff of an elected official. Started my career working for then Senator Joe Biden. Who would have known that he'd become the president of the United States at a time, a perfect time where we need him to lead our country. And then in my career, after I left Senator Biden's office, I work at Newcastle County and got very involved in budget and finance issues, just because, if you want to, Senator Biden used to always say, don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your values are. And so I learned pretty early on that the budget was where all the action was. The budget was where you really put in place and supported the values that you have and that we have as elected officials, as Democratic elected officials. I learned a lot at Newcastle County around that. I was on the team that did our bond issuing, and not as a signator, but working with the director of finance, which was Ann Nutter at the time, and a guy by the name of Ron Morris, who was an extraordinary finance and budget leader. So then when I went to work for then Governor Carper, I went on as a generalist working on a whole series of issues. And again, since your policy priorities are reflected in your budget, a lot of that came down to working with our budget director, Pete Ross, and Jeff Bullock, who was the chief of staff at the time. And when the position came open for Secretary of Finance, again, I was still Deputy Chief of Staff. I heard the folks that were being considered, and I said, well, if the governor's considering those folks, I'd like to be considered too. And so God bless him, and thanks to Tom Carper, he did give me a chance to do that without a typical, public finance background. And of course, I learned a heck of a lot more. It was a priority of Governor Carper's to earn that AAA bond rating. He had been state treasurer, as you probably know, for a couple terms, and I learned a lot. And I learned that things that became important, very important now as governor, that you need to manage your finances well if the state's going to be successful.
I love that early story and the transition. When I think about it, it to me means that you sort of left yourself open to serving, and you were open to sort of learning along the way, and I think that makes you so dynamic in your role as governor now in facing some of the challenges that are absolutely unprecedented, unpredictable, and just a really wild curveball.
Some people would say I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do when I grew up, but you're right. It was really kind of being flexible and respond and react to opportunities as they presented themselves, and to learn. I mean, I learned a lot on the job, did take some public finance courses doing my master's degree at UD, but it wasn't a traditional, trajectory into that kind of position. And I think I find it very interesting and incredibly important, particularly as Democratic elected officials, who don't normally, traditionally, are not thought of as being sound fiscal stewards of taxpayers' money. But to me, it's a high priority, and I know it is to you as state treasurer.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the other things that you touched on is the budget. The budget's huge. But one of the things that I think is really amazing is, again, as a Democrat, to continue to have that fiscal responsibility focus. We don't always get credit for that sort of thing. But one of the things that you did that was really remarkable was the establishment of the Budget Stabilization Fund. And I wonder if you can kind of speak to the fiscal year 22 budget and how maybe that stabilization fund plays into where we are today and how we've come through the pandemic.
So as you'll remember, when I first was elected and came into office, we were facing $350 million to $400 million deficit. And so as we were working with Mike Jackson, tremendous budget director, and his staff, to develop a budget proposal for the legislature in that first year, we decided that we would bridge that gap by cutting spending, about half the deficit, cutting spending, say $200 million, and half of it raising revenue through additional corporate franchise taxes, as well as a small increase in personal income taxes. And to sell that plan, I went out across the state. We did a number of town hall meetings to explain the situation, to talk to people about priorities, to get people to support what we were trying to do. And I remember really clearly a meeting that we had in the fire hall at Milford. And towards the end, a guy got up and he kind of got in my face a little bit, and he said, "Governor, I understand what you're asking us to do. But here's the deal, if I'm willing to pay a little bit more, but you have to be responsible. We expect that you and the state is going to be responsible in managing our tax dollars and doing it well." And that really sunk in with me, that was a fair deal, right? That was a fair thing for taxpayers to expect. And so after that, we recognized that we had run these budget revenue surges, and then we go into a recession, and it was something that was almost predictable every 8 to 10 years. So I look back, we had a similar situation when Mike Castle was governor towards the end of his term, 1991, and then early on in Ruth Ann Minter's term, 2001, and then of course the financial crisis, which was precipitated by something else. So we put a group together that looked at those ups and downs and said, a better way of doing this is to try to cut a stable course in spending, so that you weren't always kind of raising revenue cutting spending, raising revenue, cutting spending to meet these cycles. And so they came up, the DFAC group came up with the idea of a Budget Stabilization Act. We proposed a constitutional amendment that would tie the governor's budget proposal to a spending target that would be determined by the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee, of which you're a member, and didn't fly, didn't pass in the legislature, and so I did an executive order, basically saying that we, as the administration, would follow these rules. And as it turns out, it has served us incredibly well. We didn't. The old rules would allow you to spend into a revenue bubble, which we had a year or two after I came into office, and then force you to cut spending or raise taxes when revenues went down. Instead, we used the Budget Stabilization Act, which is set aside as a reserve in addition to our 5% rainy day fund, limited spending so that when revenues dropped, as they did precipitously after COVID-19 hit last spring, we weren't in a position where we had a minor deficit, but we were able to continue our trajectory without cutting necessary programs, the disruption that creates, and going to the people to raise taxes. We have a great graph that shows the effect of that approach in terms of spending, with the ups and downs on the revenue side. And so it's served us well, and will into the future.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that it's served us well, and I think we saw it glaringly, obviously, this year. One of the other things that I think about, in 2019, mid 2019, I had the opportunity to speak with some of the folks at the SEC, and they highlighted Delaware. So kind of going back to the concept of the AAA rating, they highlighted Delaware and some of the processes that we have going on. You mentioned DFAC is one of them. Can you talk a little bit about some of the other fiscal controls that we have in place? Because as a small state, we really are a bit of a shining star in comparison to other states. And I'd love for you to highlight some of those things as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there's no question about it. We have really sound fiscal controls that were really put in place in the mid to late 1970s by then Governor Pete DuPont, improved on by Governor Castle, who followed Pete DuPont. And so essentially it requires us, as we prepare a budget each year, number one, it starts with DFAC, which is the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee. It's a group, as you know, of elected officials, appointed officials representing various sectors of the economy, academic economists at the University of Delaware and other places. And they establish each year a revenue estimate on which the governor's budget must be based, and the budget passed by the legislature must be based. That seems like a simple thing. Doesn't happen in every other state. And it starts off with a 50-50 estimate about what those revenues are going to be. Because if you don't have that kind of an estimate, a sound estimate, which we did not have in the mid-1970s. In fact, the governor had one estimate and the legislature had their own. The legislature passed their own budget over Pete DuPont's veto, and it just was a mess. So they created these rules, 5% rainy day fund, and then it limits without a super majority, unless there's a super majority vote, to a budget only 98% of those estimated revenues. So that's 7% cushion if the revenues turn out not to be on course. And we find that often that when an economy is strengthening, DFAC's estimate tends to lag below the actual number. On the other side, when an economy or a recession is coming on, similarly, DFAC's estimates tends to follow. And so you need that cushion. So the rainy day fund, the 98% a budget limit have served the state well. We've got a strong and more diverse economy than we ever did. And that's why we were rated as a AAA bond rating in Governor Carper's last couple years when I had the privilege to serve as a Secretary of Finance.
Yeah, and I think just what I hear from other states and from other investors, by publishing that and being so transparent with those projections, people feel a lot more confident in investing in our state, in our AAA bond rating, and in our bonds. And so it's really remarkable just that that you've taken it a step further in establishing that budget stabilization fund. I think it puts another feather in our cap and really solidifies that responsible fiscal policy. I want to jump over to COVID. I think it's a topic that everyone is.
I thought we might get by without talking about COVID for 15 minutes or so, but I guess that's not the case.
Well, ultimately, Delaware, like everyone else in the world, has been impacted by COVID, and not just financially, but one of the things that I'd like to talk about is just that we've seen a specific impact on our economy. I have heard from lots of other officials in other states how they've been trying to deal with COVID in a responsible way and in a way that doesn't completely quelch our economy and some of that upward movement that we were seeing. A lot of the things that I've heard is just that you've done a phenomenal job, and I'd love for you to highlight some of the things, maybe some of the challenges that you've been able to overcome in the process of trying to deal with COVID.
Well, thanks for that compliment. I normally hear just the opposite, that people aren't happy with what we're doing. And of course, now where our priority really is on vaccinating as many people as we can, as fast and fair as we can, when we don't have nearly the supply for the demand in our state. Just really a very difficult undertaking and a lose-lose situation. We kind of look at it this way. First of all, you have to keep the community as healthy as possible. You've got to address the spread of the virus, crush the spread of the virus, if you will, and get the community healthy while trying to keep the economy as healthy as possible at the same time, and then accelerate out of this thing as it winds down, God willing, that it will. And so we have really focused on putting in place protective measures, following the science, the recommendations of the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, making sure that people wear masks, keep socially distanced, limiting large social gatherings, which we know is where so much of the spread occurs. We've learned an incredible amount. We came into this thing without a lot of knowledge or experience back in the spring. At the time, the CDC was ambivalent about wearing face coverings. The most important thing now, wear a face covering all the time. It mostly protects others from respiratory particles that you might be emitting, don't even know that you're sick. That's one of the things we've also learned. But we're also learning that it protects you from respiratory particles that come from other folks. So get healthy, number one. Number two is support our business community, particularly the small businesses. We've used hundreds of millions of dollars of federal CARES Act dollars to support mostly our hospitality industry, our bars, restaurants, hospitality, gathering places, other small businesses, unlike more than other states around us have been doing. We've used $200 million to replenish the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. And that's really support as much for those workers, really more for the businesses, because without that infusion of cash and capital, they would have to replenish the fund with an increase in their own insurance or the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund at a time when they really can't afford it. So we've used $200 million to prevent a future tax increase for small businesses. And then finally, funding certificate programs and other ways of folks that find themselves unemployed they can get new skills and get in some of these jobs. What's ironic about the situation is a lot of the hospitality business have been really hurt, and then other business have thrived through this. For, just think about the box business, the delivery business, drivers, truck drivers, all this kind of thing. And so those three things have been our priority: get healthy and get the community safe, strengthen and support your small businesses in particular with hundreds of millions of dollars, and then help your workforce accelerate out of this as we vaccinate the people of our state.
It goes back to what you've always done is you've been accessible and you've remained engaged. You talked about at the Milford Fire Hall really being, called to task by a Delaware citizen. And it's one of the unique things about Delaware is just how truly accessible all elected officials are, but in particular, up at the top with you. Again, thank you so much for being here today, Governor Carney. It's been an honor to speak with you, and I hope we get a chance to do this again. Take care.